Welcome to the Aconic Podcast with me, Soon Yu, your host. The Aconic Podcast features candid conversations with successful Asian and AAPI leaders who share their personal journeys of challenges and triumphs. The Aconic Podcast is brought to you by the Asian American Foundation, by Goldhouse, and by the founders of the Asian Alumni Chapter of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and is made possible through the generous support of Altos Ventures.
The book at that point was years overdue and under contract, but it more than just sort of like a sort of deliverable, it felt like a failing on a deeper level. Like, I can't tell this story in a way that I thought I could, and that this is the time I've really tried to dig deep and tell something that feels more personal, and I have failed.
Welcome to the Aconic Podcast. It is a privilege to welcome Charlie Yu to the podcast. Charlie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm actually very excited because you are our first guest, and hopefully not our last, that's really expanding us beyond what has traditionally been, for at least the first, I would say, 8 or 9 episodes, more of a business podcast that has obviously reached into the community, into civic leadership. And there are so many iconic Asian leaders that are in other fields, and especially in the creative arts field. And so thank you for helping us to expand our universe. And in such a wonderful way, because you are incredibly accomplished for what you do. You are a celebrated American novelist. But just for our audience, in case you don't know, Charlie is the executive producer and the author of Interior Chinatown, which is a hit series on Hulu. And I always look up Rotten Tomatoes, right? Because I think that's a really good indicator, because you get both critics and audience sort of scores. You're off the charts. You have like an 87 on the critics and 80% for the audience, which, I mean, combined together, that is really in the upper echelon of TV programming or any type of what I call entertainment. So congratulations on that. You're award-winning author on the book you wrote prior to Interior Chinatown, which is, I want to make sure I get this, How to Live Safely in a Science Fiction Universe. You've been recognized as the 5 under 35 by the National Book Foundation. You're in the top lists or have won awards for Amazon, Time Magazine, New York Times, and Interior Chinatown won the National Book Award for Fiction. So congratulations on those incredible accomplishments. And I really appreciate you coming in and really kind of expanding, um, the conversation to different fields of what I call the hero's journey. And when I look at your your hero's journey, it's really fun because you have a hero's journey, but you're also kind of a storytelling hero, right? Because part of it, you're experiencing the hero's journey yourself, but you're also telling about other heroes and creating new heroes for us. And so I think that's really exciting. And so anyway, so those are some things we're going to unpack. Um, when I was looking at what you've done, it's really interesting. You are really writing about stories of not coming of age, but more coming of identity. Okay.
Mm.
And a lot of times your protagonists, they're on quests to either search for lost loved ones or for something else. And I think through it, they actually find themselves. And so I find that very fascinating. And you weave in a lot of your rich history, your background. Some of your characters are obviously influenced by people that you have grown up with. And one of the most seminal happens to be your parents. So let's just start there. You grew up kind of like me. You were uh, a son of immigrants from Taiwan. So can you talk about kind of growing up and your parents' influence on your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I first of all, thank you for that introduction. That's incredible, and you made it all sound so cohesive. And I'm excited to talk to you about a lot of what you touched on. My parents were immigrants from Taiwan. They came, as many did, as part of the wave post 65. And my dad came first in 65, actually. Um, to Mississippi. He got like a graduate student fellowship. He went to National Taiwan University undergrad and had a graduate student fellowship at, I want to say, Mississippi State. Um, and and so, and then my mom came a few years later, I think in '69, through her sister was sort of the anchor, and so she was able to come through her sister who had was living in Alabama. So interestingly enough, or to me anyway, my parents both kind of moved to the South. That's where they started their lives as as immigrants in America. They met here and they eventually settled in Southern California. My dad ended up being an aerospace engineer. And so I grew up actually in LA proper until high school, and then went to high school in the suburbs south of LA in Palos Verdes. And, it's me and my brother. So I was the older of two. And I think, watching my parents sort of struggle and, try to assimilate and learn how to be Americans was really, in so many ways, both the personal, but also ends up being kind of a professionally formative thing. Because in a lot of ways, I think I still write about, as you said, I love what you said, that these are coming of age in the sense of their journeys of identity, of either sort of revealing your identity or coming to grips with it, or admitting to yourself sort of what you really are, or discovering that as well.
Your parents are obviously a big influence, but also how you grew up was really interesting. I think early on, you actually had a desire to be a writer, a storyteller, and yet you grew up in a very traditional, sort of Taiwanese background or immigrant lifestyle in terms of getting, having good grades, probably going to a good school like Berkeley, studying science, or, and so how did you have this sort of internal calling, and how did you let that flourish, or how did it sort of fester inside of that environment?
Yeah, that's I think from a very young age I liked writing. I liked words. My parents both in certain ways, like my mom was a natural storyteller. She's,
Hmm.
definitely, she wasn't a writer, but she was a great talker. And my dad is actually quite good with languages, and so I think he the combination of sort of their two traits, and he also had this home, his home study had like shelves and shelves of books, mostly like science and math and engineering books. But um, I think just from a young age, walking into that space, there was this almost kind of reverential feeling of like, how much does he know? How would I, how do you read all these books? And so from a like 4 or 5, I would always kind of carry around books. And when I was 8 or 9, I started like writing little things down. And so even as I was heading into undergrad, I already knew I wanted to explore that part of university life, like literary magazines. And I joined a couple of literary journals as a volunteer. And um, yeah, the tension was that my parents were like, you have to study something more practical. So I did. But the compromise, and it wasn't really a compromise because I was doing it against their wishes. I minored in creative writing, and I was taking poetry classes and writing poems, which, to and the hierarchy of things for parents to worry, especially Taiwanese immigrant parents, like poetry, like couldn't it like be journalism or screenwriting where you could make some living out of like poetry? I was like, yes, I picked the worst possible thing for you, Taiwanese parents. But yeah, that I think, but it did really, it's weird because I do blame it on them. I think they were really attuned to words, like to the way their accent sounded. I think the way that my dad had this kind of deep intellectual curiosity about things. He still does, he's 85, and he still wants to learn, he's still always, as parents do, sending me articles, but also he wants to learn everything about Hollywood. Any topic that I'm interested in, he'll want to dive in, and I love that about him. And I think I picked that kind of curiosity. I think the other thing I picked up from him as well is that um, he really reserved judgment. I think he's really kind of somebody who, for better or worse, evaluates data and information and doesn't draw opinions quickly. He's just somebody who's constantly collecting more and more. And I think that is a kind of natural thing for a novelist to do.
Interesting. So you grew up observing and being sort of inspired by what your parents were, both their talents and kind of their interests, even though it wasn't maybe their professions. And I'm sure they use those talent and interests to be good in the professions. But those behavioral traits are the things that kind of influence you, along with, I think I read that you both read a lot, but watched a ton of TV. So you were always like probably interested in stories and characters and plots and whatnot. So I think that's really interesting. And I really love this idea because I think a lot of our listeners are going to relate to this, that you're trying to straddle two things here. You're trying to straddle the expectations of, being successful, so to speak, in the culture that you were growing up with, at the same time having a real interest in something that, quite frankly, wasn't viewed on the track of success. And yet, I think that is actually what's made you incredibly successful, and your ability to bring both different, I think, universes or genres into your writing is because of your ability to have straddled different places. And the ability to mash things up, I think it partly is probably a result of the fact that you've had to kind of had two hats, so to speak, and multiple hats oftentimes. So talk about that. You're in Berkeley
Hmm.
and you went to the traditional, let's call it degree of, I think you were molecular and cellular biology, right? I mean, I had a lot of friends, and basically for me, that meant pre-med, I guess. You know, I, now, I'm not saying that that was for you, but a lot of times I had friends that were in those fields, and I knew that they were going to be either great scientists or great doctors. Um, and yet, on the side, you were doing poetry. How was that?
Yeah, it was. You totally hit on it. I mean, I think I've always either you could think of it as I have one foot out the door, but a better way to look at it is I do sort of have my I've never quite felt inside of a world fully. Like I have this I do actually have social anxiety. I kind of found that out later in life. When I got to like grad law school, which we can talk about, I really fully it hit me. I realized how much social anxiety I have. But I think being kind of an observer and never fully feeling in a community is just sort of a natural thing for a writer because I think it's easier to observe things if you're not in the middle of it, right? If you're off to
Right.
the side. And I think, yeah, being a science major who was actually, I felt like I was kind of, um, you know, d- like I was most people were pre med. I was also pre med or pre grad, and but really, I was like, my heart is somewhere else. I'm just doing this to, sort of please my parents. I don't know what will happen if I end up going to medical school because I literally can't imagine making it all the way through. Luckily for me, I didn't get it. Luckily for also human beings, I'm not a doctor because I would have been a terrible doctor. um, but I think that kind of weird duality or marginality has always been. I mean, even going back to like high school, I was like, I was on the wrestling team. I wasn't great at it, but I did sports. I liked that. That was part of me, and I was also on the math team, and I was like a bench warmer on the math team. Like there are all these guys who are really like out of this world smart, who are like professors now of computer science, and all went to Harvard, MIT, and I was like good enough to make it onto the math team, which was like sort of no small feat at our school, but not good enough to like contribute. so so I think they looked at me as like, "What are you doing here?" You're sort of like this slacker, and I don't know. I think something about always having been, and then I think that even extended, yeah, on the writing side too. In a way, it felt like I'm these people maybe are all going to go on to grad school for literature, for MFA programs, and want to teach writing. But I was like, that's not going to be my life either. Like I don't know what I'm going to do with all this writing, but I'm not going to on that track. I just have never fully felt like I had a track. And that like ended up me going to law school.
Right, and you went to Columbia to get your, I mean, that's a huge investment. Now you didn't, I guess let's be honest, you probably tried for medical school. That wasn't in the cards. And you went to law school and you actually, I think, practiced for 9 years after law school. But what was so interesting, and let's talk about this, is that in the middle of both your undergrad at Berkeley, then your JD at Columbia, you have always had this interest in writing. I think that's one theme. I think the other theme, I think this is really interesting. And I want to share this with the audience. Sometimes we're taught that we have to be the best at something and excel and get even deeper and specialize in that. And I think there's a lot of reward and recognition for doing something like that. But I also think there's a lot of reward and recognition for being the bench warmer for many things because as a bench warmer, you observe the starting team doing their stuff, and obviously you have to be ready to step in at any time, and so you have to learn that role, but you have a lot of time to observe. And the other thing is you're never trapped, meaning that you're kind of used to not being the A player, the B player, but if you're B player in a lot of different things, your ability to probably see different points of views and easily facilitate or have empathy with others in different, call it unrelated fields, is probably much greater. And I think that worked to your favor. It's kind of like this idea that you were a jack of many trades, master of none, but that allowed you to be somebody who could write about so many different things and actually probably helped you become even a better and a different writer than most people that probably got an MFA.
I mean, that's the most positive spin you could put on being a
Be a B player?
like,
Well,
what?
there's a lot of okay, I hate to say this. Not everyone's gonna be a player that listens to this. And I'm telling you guys, look, that's okay. You don't have to be the A players, right? And Charlie, you're kind of the shining example of what a B player can do.
I wish my mom were alive to hear this. This is so I'm gonna play this for my dad, obviously. Yes, I think, joking aside, I think there's a deep truth in what you're saying. Is that most people in life are, and even the people who excel in one thing are not going to excel in anything else. Probably, like we're not, they're just very rare. And then to what you said is interesting because I think if you look to use one example at like a lot of NBA or NFL coaches, right? They weren't necessarily star players. A lot of times they were key role players, right? Or they
Steve
were
Kerr. I mean,
right. But something about that maybe I don't know. I mean, I this is me kind of going on a limb, but I feel like there's something about what you said for sure that you maybe picked up other skills from the bench watching it. And I think that's a fascinating idea. I feel like personally I can attest to that. I think I went to, to be real for a second, I went to Columbia because partly I felt like my parents had worked so hard and I knew that they were a little worried about my future when I didn't get into any medical schools. I personally felt like, man, if I don't sort of, do something and consolidate sort of credentials, like I like people for to be real, when you're at that age and you've got like we don't have money, like our family didn't have a ton of, my they had done pretty well, like they kind of climbed the ladder of mobility a bit, but we had no wealth at all, right? No family money. And I'm like, I should get some reputational capital. I need to go get a degree from somewhere fancy because people are going to, I mean, Berkeley's plenty fancy, but I was like, people are going to judge me and I need to find a field where I, this is me thinking when I was 22 years old, like where my parents won't be embarrassed. They can talk to other Taiwanese friends and not feel like, "Oh my god, what's happening with our kid?" Um, I think as though, growing up, I'd had so many expectations placed on me, and honestly, I did feel like a B player, even though I'd gotten to Berkeley, like, the hope was that I'd go to Stanford, you know what I mean? Like, it's even though I went to, like I ended up working at, some great places, but I think for a long time, I did feel like in so many ways, the expectations were set so high that I was always kind of B plussing it or,
Mhm.
and I was like, what do you do with that feeling? Like, and in a lot of ways, it almost felt like a B plus is worth nothing. And it's like, as I get older, and this is something I, as a parent too, it's like the value of doing things, not even necessarily, not just not extremely well, but there's the value of doing things with sincere effort, regardless of the result. Like that's really what it's about. But it took a long time for me to get there. And I think that did feed into the writing as well, because writing as a kind of pursuit, you could chase, I guess, awards or recognition or sales. But from the beginning for that, it wasn't that for me because I was too kind of niche, I think, especially at the beginning, for me to realistically think, oh, I'm going to be a bestseller. I'm going to win awards. I was definitely doing that for myself. And I think that's part of where I netted out in all of it is that that was the one thing I always had for myself that wasn't really about like external validation.
Oh, I love that. I love your journey. I love the idea that even when you made the math team in one of the most, let's call, recognized, math schools in probably in the country, Palos Verdes. I mean, come on, I mean, you got a bunch of brilliant, bright kids, attending that school, um, yet you still felt less than, right? I think that's such a interesting concept, and yet, in many ways, being less than allowed you to be more of many different things and didn't close any doors for you. In fact, probably left more being, your foot halfway in a lot of different places, probably allowed you sort of many more options, which I think is fascinating. On the Aconic Podcast, we really celebrate the idea of the hero's journey. And fortunately for us, one of our partner organizations is at the forefront of celebrating our great heroes and their stories. And that organization we work with is Gold House. Gold House is a cultural ecosystem that unites, invests, and champions Asian Pacific leaders to power tomorrow for all of us. To learn more, please visit goldhouse.org. One thing I also want to touch on a little bit because you do talk about the themes. When you were growing up, and a lot of the guests I have, we talk about this, but this idea of feeling other. And I know that obviously, many of your short stories and your books touch on this theme of the perpetual foreigner or just not always feeling like you fit in. Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of formulated from your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for me, there's kind of the main layer would be feeling other. I think as an Asian American kid, but I'll be honest, my high school was I don't know the numbers, but probably 25% Asian, Asian American at least, maybe more. And Berkeley certainly was 35 at probably around then 35%, but at that point. So it was there's this kind of other layer to it, which was um being Taiwanese American, which was a kind of smaller minority within that. And I think there was almost a kind of like um preemptive, like not defensiveness, but like like imposter syndrome of like, am I going to have to explain this to people even within, or even potentially get in arguments with people? And I'm not like at a high school, college level, I'm not here to have like political arguments with people. So more what it was I ended up being internalizing a sense of like, I don't really want to talk that much about sort of my identity. I kind of want to smooth off as many edges as I can and like learn how to navigate environments in a way that people like me. I mean, I became a kind of or I molded myself in a way to like be a kind of pleaser,
Mhm.
and I think a lot of that's still in me, and a lot of that's probably just my predisposition, just who I am. But I think some of it was formulated by sort of the circumstances of that's kind of how my parents did it too. At least my dad. I think my parents had very different strategies for how to navigate sort of, you know, society and workplace and that. But I think I gravitated more towards my dad being, honestly pretty introverted, especially when I was younger. I think the way that I navigated was through words and trying to be as articulate as possible and trying to I don't know, on some level, almost like culturally assimilate to as the greatest degree possible, to really like blend in, especially as I entered work environments that were predominantly white. Like I was very much conscious of being, that's really when I felt other is going out of like a place like Berkeley or Columbia even, and then into a work environment where I was suddenly was, you know, much I was part of a smaller minority there at the first couple places I worked. So I think, I don't know if I exactly hit on your question, but I think in a lot of ways it was a kind of strategy of like, um, uh, not hiding, but like, oh, are you okay? Um, yeah, yeah. I think I was sort of circling around it, but I'm not exactly hitting on your question, I think.
Well, you're circling around in a very powerful way, which to me is you've redefined other in so many different layers, right? A lot of times it was like, oh, we were the only Asian American growing up. Well, you weren't,
Right.
but even societal or from a cultural point of view, it's this idea that any difference we have, subtle, could be just not being not Chinese or Taiwanese, right? Or whatever it might be, or I'm a more of a creative thinker, or I enjoy creative, I enjoy poetry. No one else does, and then trying to figure out how that allows you to be relevant, right, with the prevailing whatever it might be, energy or people or whatever is of interest at the time. That and not causing waves. I think to me that has always been central. This idea of growing up Asian American, right? And then I think the struggle has always been how much assimilation, and I think all of us have had it. And then once we assimilate, it's like, okay, we've assimilated by not rocking the boat and by having some degree of acceptance. But also then we struggle with imposter syndrome, right? It comes with this idea of, and eventually we have to go through all of that to eventually find a way to have our own voice. But I feel like you have to go through all that to actually, because if you start off with the initial assumption that, hey, somehow we are not welcomed. Okay, that sort of starts with there's something that's not welcoming here. How do we become more welcome? And in the process of doing that, do we lose ourselves or do we feel like an imposter? And at some point, how do we actually find ourselves through the end of that journey? And Willis kind of goes through that, right? In Interior Chinatown. And so I think that's really interesting. That experience translated into how you wrote about this idea of feeling different and wanting to be accepted, and then the journey to get accepted, and then realizing once you're accepted, is that who I really am? Am I comfortable with that? And then who am I? So I love that. It just shows up in all your writing, right? So it's great. Um, I want to go into Interior China, but before that, really quickly, I just want to talk about this idea that you actually not only ended up getting your JD, you worked for about 9 years as a corporate attorney. I'm sure in a celebrated, firm, and you were doing, I guess, maybe B plus work? Because on the side, I think you were still writing. In fact, I think you had published 3 books by the time you were actually, somehow serendipitously, you actually got a job writing for Westworld. Can you talk about how that was either intentionally opportunistic or opportunistically intentional? I don't know. How did that happen?
Yeah. I don't know which one it was either. It was a lot of luck, but it was a slow building thing, like it felt like it, oh my God, this is huge break. And but it's because yeah, I had published 3 books at that point, and enough so that I think, and I think partly because I live in LA, I had started to have like meetings with like s- studio executives or producers, just a few, but I had kind of been able to dip my toe a little bit into the world of TV and film, and somehow I got on the radar of the showrunners for Westworld. Whether it was through HBO or it was through, they maybe had heard of my writing. I mean, I seemed hard to imagine, but they they read something I wrote, and I got to interview for the job. I mean, that's really what it was. I had thought at that point I had started to, I was working with a, Hollywood agent who's still my agent, for mostly though for selling the rights to my stories and books potentially, right? So at that point, I was um thinking that would be the way I could sort of enter um, the world of TV and film. And maybe that's my great exit from the law, is that someone's going to buy the rights to my book for, whatever, $1 million. And then I can, go walk in and tell my boss like, I'm leaving. Well, I mean, it kind of happened, but the thing that the way it happened was so much less dramatic and so much, it doesn't make for as exciting a scene. It's actually quite sweet, as my boss was aware that I was at that point. He, was aware and very supportive. And so when I told him I got this incredible job, he was like, amazing, this is what you wanted to do. Now, that said, I had been kind of looking slash thinking of how to get out because I was so uh I was struggling with Interior Chinatown, the writing of the book. And to the point where I actually had talked to my boss a few months earlier about taking a leave maybe to finish the book. So I think it's easy to, in retrospect, for me to like, I even forget sometimes, like the narrative feels like I was working, 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 and I get a call and then I go to this job. But actually, there was a lot more uncertainty. Like my wife and I had just moved to Orange County and we have two kids and we had a new mortgage and we were really nervous about like, what are we going to do? And yet she was still like trying to push me to find a way to finish this book. So all of these things came kind of to a head. And then I end up getting this job on Westworld, which, we can, if it's interesting to you and you're to the listeners, I can talk about it, but it very much replaced my day job. It's a very much a full-time job. So
Right.
I end up going from one kind of very demanding job to another, but it was kind of this, like amazing dream come true moment. And that's how I sort of made the transition, at sort of almost the age of 40. I was 39 when,
Wow.
or yeah.
You were almost 40 when this happened. And look, I want to set the stage for the audience to understand this. It wasn't like, oh, somebody threw a couple $1,000,000 and you could just quit your job. It wasn't quite like that. You actually had a decision. You could stay with the current role or current job that you had, probably make more money than this other opportunity. But this other opportunity was really interesting and sort of was more in line with what your passion was, right? And what you really wanted to do. And I also read about this prior to working on Westworld. It wasn't like you were a huge financial success with your writing. It wasn't like you were bringing in the bacon with this. It was you had some critical acclaim, right? That people had seen it, read, says good stuff. This is really different, interesting, new ways of thinking, and that's all great. But it doesn't translate to Amazon sales. It doesn't translate to like somehow getting rights on some movie or TV show. None of that had happened, and so when you actually made that transition to follow your passion, you were trading down on certain things. Like, there were probably but at least you knew that there was probably 6 to 12 months of somewhat steady income, right? That hopefully you could springboard into something else and maybe something to pay for benefits. I don't know. But I just want the audience to understand that is not something that was actually a simple transition. It was one where there was a certain degree of uncertainty attached to it. Is that fair?
That's totally fair. That's exactly right. Yeah. I I think you nailed it. I think I was a very risk averse person. This wasn't at all a kind of thing where I was, yeah, walking into a hugely secure situation. It's about as secure as a first job in TV could be, because the show had been ordered to series and it's a big show, on HBO. But maximum or minimum, it was going to give 6 months of income. And after that, I could very well be back, like, sort of looking for a job. It turned out to be longer than that, but I, yeah, and you're right. In terms of the writing itself, after 3 books and, working on my fourth, it felt like if this fourth book doesn't kind of translate to like step it up a bit, I could easily have trouble getting another book deal, like that's sort of where I was at, to be honest. And so on all kinds of levels, it was feeling pretty, you know, pretty dicey of like, what do we do? This is definitely a bunch of conversations that my wife and I were having.
I can imagine because I've had these type of conversations with both my wife and then prior to with my parents. It was dicey, but at the same time exhilarating. It was exciting. It was something where you felt like you against the world, and you were going to go and do what you can, and it brought out maybe both your fears, but also probably some of the best of you. And I think that's really sad. And so you talk about this idea. You got on the Westworld. We didn't know. No one knew it was going to be a huge success. Like to have one season's one thing, to have multiple seasons is a whole nother can of worms, right? And you were part of a team that had multiple seasons. I think at the time when you joined, it had only had a pilot out, right? And the first full season hadn't even been fully written at this time. And you talk about the process of going from writing your own books with your own thoughts to actually have to work with the team. And then something that you were probably already a little bit skilled at, but doing it with the team must have been interesting. This idea of universe building or world building or just creating a whole nother set of interior exteriors to be thinking about where a story might come to fruition. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how that was like and being part of the award winning Westworld team?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was incredible. I got to walk into a room where, I was by far the least experienced. Well, I mean, obviously, I was the least experienced. It was my first job. So I literally, day one, like, I'd never been in a writer's room and everyone's looking at me, you
And
know,
you didn't have an MFA, right? You didn't have some degree in creative writing, right?
that's true. I didn't even have like a credential in that sense. I'd have books, but those don't necessarily translate, in this arena. So I think people, I mean, to be fair, I think TV writers do look at sort of, prose writers as like, oh, you definitely, there's a respectability to it, right? There's a kind of like seriousness to it. But there are actual like sort of craft and experience, like like tangible skills that you get when you've worked in TV, even a little bit, let alone for years, like many of these people, that you're, and I was kind of walking into that and had to learn on the job, it was exhilarating. I learned, really quickly, like sort of how fast they move through ideas. I think it is kind of the ethos of like you move fast and you break things. Like there's no very little preciousness with an idea. Not to say there's not care. It's not like throw everything at the wall and try everything and just like stumble on something. It's not that, but there is a kind of like when a writer's room is working well together, it feels like, a team sport is what people.
And how many people are in this room?
This one, it varies room to room. This one was 8,
Wow. Okay.
plus, an assistant. So, yeah, 9 people in a room, 2 showrunners, and, a lot of really experienced, really wonderful people. And so, yeah, I think that what I just it felt like every day you're going into a kind of boot camp, but it's also like, idea sort of factory, like, and coming out of it, I felt this kind of new energy, like I was like getting in shape almost like for, like
Yeah.
writing muscles.
I can't imagine that. I mean, plus you're learning the hierarchy of communication inside of a team that has had a lot
That's
of different experiences, and there's probably some politics slash, you know, and that must have been really exciting. But so you guys were hugely successful. Let's face it. That allowed you to both get exposure to, I guess, Hollywood and to entertainment in a much different way. And I think a lot of that probably influenced or might have somewhat influenced how you ended up writing Interior Chinatown, because Interior Chinatown is a story that satires Hollywood. So therefore, you without that intimate knowledge of how Hollywood worked, it probably would never fit into Interior Chinatown. Um, although I believe your brother is also an accomplished TV writer. I think he wrote American Born Chinese, and he's an actor himself. So I guess you've had exposures and influences. Um, but let's talk about Interior China. I mean, what a wonderful! I have the book here. I've thumbed through it. I've not read it all, but it is. It is. I thought I had to buy it because it's visual art. It is not just written art. The written art is really fantastic, but it's how the words lay out on the pages, how you actually there's a lot of design, intentional design, and actually how you actually laid this out. It's written more of a screenplay. Can you describe how much innovation you actually brought to the genre of writing a novel?
um well, thank you for pointing out the visual aspect to it. I think that was important to me, and just for readers who aren't familiar, it is written primarily, or big parts of it are written in the form of a screenplay or of a teleplay of a TV show. And right. Yeah, there you're and so what you have is a sort of narrative, a story within the story. You have a character, Willis, who is not actually in the story, but he wants to be in the story. And so, for years, I sort of played with this idea of what does that mean? What does it look like? And it wasn't until I think working in the Westworld room for a couple of years that I, as you say, like both had this kind of inner view of it that gave me both the confidence and the actual knowledge of like, here's how it kind of works. Um, and then I think the idea of this NPC, this kind of background guy sort of sneaking into the narrative.
Describe what NPC means for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. 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 NPC, video game term, non-playable character is the, person if you're playing, now I'm going to date myself with reference. Like if you're playing Zelda and you walk up to like this little elf and someone's like, you got to go that way. That's an NPC because they're not someone
It's
you,
the movie Free Guy, right? Free Guy. That was a movie on NPC. Right, okay.
right. Yeah. Right. I know when the show got picked up and we started shooting it, and people would hear the pitch, they'd be like, "Oh, so Free Guy." I'm like, "Oh, I wrote the book before Free Guy. I promise. I didn't rip off Free Guy. I mean, I like that movie, um, but yeah. So Willis is essentially a non-protagonist, right? And he wants to have a part in the story, and I think a lot of that did come from the experience of working in TV, specifically in Westworld, I would say. But I had a bunch of other jobs after that also informed it. But yeah, I think visually and conceptually, I was trying to play around with things, and this goes back to what you were talking about earlier of like feeling like I never want to be sort of center field. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm coming at things from a different way, and almost to the point where it seems like play or not serious, but it's actually the way in for me. And so I wrote this thing where there are certain pages where it's, the text is in the margin or Willis's dialogue is in the margin because, you have this dimension to a book. Why not use it? Like, books don't have to be sort of unbroken chunks of uniform, sort of visual, you know, um, length and width. And so I think playing around with things has always been, yeah, for better or worse, just my way of doing things.
I think it's incredibly fascinating you're bringing innovation to novel writing. Just so happens you're Asian American, which is great because then you're able to actually infuse the context of being Asian American and the themes of that also as visual themes in how you write. And so in some ways you're changing the way novels can be written, or you're breaking the rules of how novels can be written, and you're using your Asian American experience as a backdrop to demonstrate how to innovate novel writing. And I guess it could be you could say one is sort of generating the others generating. Well, maybe you had to break the rules of novel writing to tell the Asian American experience better too. But that could possibly be it too. There's a line I love in the book, and I want to just share it. And it's a life at the margin made from bit parts. And basically, what this is really describing is this idea that Willis, I guess he's a background character in a TV show that's kind of like the Law and Order. And I think you're being interviewed by Noah, Noah Trevor, and you basically described it as I watched Law and Order, and I was looking at the stereotypical Asian roles, and it'd probably be a guy with a Chinese delivery van loading, I don't know, groceries, in the background of a scene in Law and Order. And your whole question was, well, what's the delivery guy's view of life? What's going on with him? And how do I write a story about somebody who is not the main character, but is really not even a bit character, is just sort of background of the background. And I thought that was incredibly fantastic. And describe describe that process of being in the margin and then having the character try to actually become a protagonist.
Yeah, I mean, it this is almost like synthesizing from the beginning of the conversation. I think you've laid it out so well in terms of just like it draws on from the earliest ideas that I sort of absorbed from my immigrant parents to me trying to like figure out how to, be the best bench warmer I could be on various teams. Um, I think the central idea for me was that this voice, Willis's voice, was like, I'm generic Asian man number three. That's a line from the book that's the role that's been given to him, or it's the role that he's sort of assigned for himself, that he's accepted. And I'm, if anything, more interested than the second part than the latter, right? Is that the internalization of that, of the limitations that as an Asian American, I have felt at various times in my life, and that I think underlies the psychology for a lot of Asian Americans, especially I would say of like our generation. I feel like it is different from my kids. I think there's been a lot of progress. I think there's still a long way to go in many ways, but I do feel like there was something true of that sort of first generation post 65 and their offspring, that was like so many things were first time, and so many things were sort of untested, and there wasn't this normalization of hardly anything. And so you there's a certain, but what I do think is interesting about that is that there have been other writers. I mean, I'm a bit part of not a movement intentionally, but of like a cohort of writers, I think, around my generation, that write from these slightly like fantasy or sci-fi perspectives, because they're trying to grapple with a reality where they don't totally understand the rules, but they're, as A students, as aspiring good students, they want to understand the rules and they want to offer something to the environment. And I think that's really what Willis is. He's like, I want to be part of that, like, how do I be part of that? And what, for me, the journey has been, as a storyteller anyway, as a writer, has been, what do I offer more than anything else? And it's really like the perspective of somebody from the background. It's like you can actually, you almost like take the weakness and make it a strength. And the quote weakness is, I'm in the background and I have been, and I'm the quiet person. And that turns out like I've if I think I offer some kind of perspective and voice that you don't normally hear, and
Mhm.
that's what I wanted to pour into Willis, because I think Willis and this is not an autobiography by any means, but I think what Willis is a for me, an avatar of so many of those internalized limitations. And what we're really watching is a guy who is saying, um, I a lot of these barriers are illusory, like a lot of these things that I've been putting in front of myself, I can actually find a way through it. I just have to, it sounds corny, but I just have to believe.
And I have to believe, and I have to be resourceful, and I have to maybe go back to what I'm good at and somehow use that resourcefully as a way to either game the system or win in the system. I think that part was really interesting. During the height of the Asian hate crimes, I was left with a sense of disbelief and anger. These feelings prompted me to write a Forbes article titled, "Who Owns the AAPI Brand?" It's clear that branding such a diverse community is difficult. Yet in the absence of a cohesive brand narrative, derogatory stereotypes and racial slurs were created. Fortunately, the AAPI community did come together and form TAF, the Asian American Foundation, to not only combat Asian hate, but to also share positive narratives that fight bias and promote belonging. TAF has launched numerous programs to support this effort, including the Aconic Podcast. Please visit TAF.org to learn more, and to subscribe to this podcast, please visit aconicpodcast.com. Join me in supporting TAF, because together we make a difference. I know you said it's not biographical. I get that, but there are obviously elements of influence of you, whether it be your parents, you, your brother, who, whatnot, right? Um, and I want to talk about this whole idea of the podcast, which is, hey, we have people like yourself who've been incredibly, whether by design or by, let's call it luck or whatnot, incredibly successful at what they do. And obviously, it's not just luck. I mean, you're bringing so much new innovation into the world of writing and just, I mean, into the American culture, right? Um, but whether it's reflected in Willis or just in your own life, there have been moments when it's been hard. I'm sure there have been tough moments where you were probably trying to be a writer and it just wasn't there, and you kind of almost wanted to give up. And we talk about this idea of hitting rock bottom, where you kind of lost hope, or quite frankly, you didn't like yourself or what you saw, and you kind of had to find something new or learn something about yourself. Can you talk about that moment for you and how that might have influenced everything you've done, especially in your writing?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I touched on it briefly earlier. I had been struggling with the book for with Interior Chinatown for a few years actually before I sort of had a breakthrough. And I was going to quit. I really threw up my hands. I had kind of signaled to my publisher and my agent. The book at that point was years overdue and under contract, but it more than just sort of like a sort of deliverable, it felt like like a failing on a like a deeper level. Like I can't tell this story in a way that I thought I could, and that this is the time I've really tried to dig deep and tell something that feels more personal, and I have failed. I either lack of conviction or lack of ability, and I mean, honestly, it was my wife who was like, um, "You, first of all, like you're being a big baby, like, like you
We
have."
all are. Come on, that's part of it, right? That's good.
um, but I think she was like, basically, you really have to sort of bet on yourself. I think what she told me, and I remember that often, is like to bet on myself, because that's actually not something that occurs to me naturally, and I've tried. I think we've been married a long time now, going on 20 years. So I've absorbed some of her kind of, um, uh, you know, inner confidence in that way. But I think the idea of like, you're doing all these other things, yeah, for respectability or for stability for our family. And those aren't necessarily bad. Those are good values and things to pursue for sure. But sometimes you have to take a chance and go, I'm the equivalent of maybe an entrepreneur. Like I'm going to quit the job, max out the credit cards or whatever to, call in the loans from friends and just be like, this bet is on myself. And she was like, you kind of have to do that with the book, I think. And that means in terms of time, in terms of in terms of like carving out things or dialing back commitments, but also in terms of a deeper sense of like, do you really believe you can do this? And when you're sitting there and you're giving up time with family and friends and you're giving up years of your life, like, are you going to do this or not? And I think that that was really an important moment to kind of push through and go, this thing is maybe so weird that it will sell even less copies than my previous. Like, who is this for? Like, what is this about? And somehow I think like that recommitment, I guess, the doubling down of like, I'm going to push through, and not just push through for like all those, sort of professional external reasons, but like in a way that was really true to my voice and didn't dilute what I was trying to do, and say, no, this is the story I'm trying to tell, and like defend it. I think that was important. And it was a really important training for what was to come, which is then I got to make a show out of it where you have to defend your vision to like 200 people on a daily basis. And so I think that just starting with the book, that was a big lesson for me from my wife.
Incredible. That was your sort of valley in this journey of where you're kind of at a high right now. You got a TV show. It's 87 from a critic perspective, 80% from an audience perspective. My wife and I watched every single episode as part of my research, and it
Thanks.
was a journey. It was like, wow, one minute I'm here, the next minute I'm there. It's like, and it was intellectual and emotional, and so I think I'll have to watch it again because there are so many layers inside of it, right? And we only have an hour or so for this podcast. I could go another hour, honestly, just talking about your writing style, or just talking about the idea of being interior. This just so people know, this idea of being interior is actually part of the trade of screenwriting. The INT means that you are now, from a director's perspective, setting and laying the stage of where the camera and the whole scene is going to be sort of filmed and the story is going to be told at that moment. And EXC, I guess, is when you're pulling it from an exterior point of view. So I learned something new while I was reading that. But I thought there were two interiors that I thought were really very interesting in this concept of Chinatown, not just Willis, but the idea of Chinatown being almost ancillary to the TV show itself. Like it was almost a on the margin too, right? And yet there are two sort of really, I think, iconic um interiors. One was I believe, the restaurant, right? There was the Golden Palace, and then the other was the SRO. Can you talk about how, how those two actually sort of represent Chinatown in many ways?
Yeah.
And by the way, SRO, so people understand what that is, single resident occupancy. If you go to most of the Chinatowns, and I have friends that grew up in Oakland and obviously San Francisco, that's where the majority of people in Chinatown live, and it's literally a one-room apartment with no bathroom, the shared bathroom, and you sleep, eat, dine, watch TV, all in that same room.
Yes, it still makes up a huge percentage of the housing stock in San Francisco Chinatown, I believe, and other Chinatowns, as well historically. And yes, I think I'm so glad you brought this up. I feel like that's all in a lot of ways part of the kind of psychology and the metaphor of that started with the book, and that we were trying to reflect in the show. Which was an incredible opportunity to sort of design this environment that previously had only been in my head, and get to work with so many talented people and bringing it out. But it's really to depict one, I think, these unseen, invisible people that don't normally get their stories told. Like I really enjoyed Crazy Rich Asians, but that's only one very kind of narrow experience, right? And there's so, and it's not even really, it's not set in America, right? It's in Singapore. So this to me was to tell the show on a platform like Hulu and have this potentially much bigger audience than my book could have, it is was to but ultimately the opportunity was to tell the story of this family and of these characters who are just living their ordinary lives, dealing with loss, dealing with ambition, and they love each other, they care about each other, and they're struggling in some ways. And so, but the parts like as you said, there's the kind of restaurant, and then there's the SRO, which is upstairs from the restaurant, and the kind of traditional structure of like a lot of immigrants, right? The business is on the ground floor, they live above the business. And that's literally what's happening here. They don't own the restaurant, but they work at Willis works at the restaurant. He lives upstairs, but you can also think of that as the kind of like gradient of internalization, right? It's like how much do we in Chinatown, Chinese immigrants present the shop front to the world. They present the front of the restaurant. We'll come into the Golden Palace, try our dishes. They're dressed up often, like, historically, sort of dressed up waiters, right? And there's decoration, it's ornate. And then in the kitchen, there's a different kind of environment. It's a workplace, right? It's people just gossiping, sharing about their lives, just, broing out, whatever, these guys do backstage basically. And then upstairs is really where they live their lives. It's where their family, y- you know, it cooks and eats and sleeps and lives their life. And to me, there was something like essential that I really wanted to capture in designing these spaces for the show, which comes from the book, which is that, the idea that we kind of wrap our authentic selves in these layers, but that if, and I experienced this too, as I kind of shared more and more of my writing with people, that often the thing that's stopping, real connection is thinking that other people aren't going to like the authentic self. And so the journey that Willis really goes on, and that a lot of these characters, not just Willis, but the Asian characters, but even the white and black characters, they're really
Mhm.
peeling off layers of their costumes, of their roles, and saying, this is actually who I am. I'm much messier. I'm much more awkward or real or honest. Like it's and I think to me that's what the show is actually about at its core is, as you say, the interior kind of becoming exterior.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I love how it wasn't just about being Asian, it's about being type characters or cast characters, in a story, and how, quite frankly, that's like 5% of who they are. And, whether it be Turner or whether it be, whether it be the African American, whether, it was really, I think, very revealing. Um, I could go on and on, and I would, here's what I anticipate, Charles. We're gonna have to do another interview a year or two when you come up with something even more amazing and fun, or and so, and you work with some incredible people, obviously, where they were your guest stars. And one of the questions we always ask at the end of the podcast is, who would you like to see on the podcast that had have a fun story, interesting story, inspiring story to share with our listeners?
Oh my gosh. That is hard. I think you should have Jimmy and Ronnie as dual guests. Have you ever
Oh, dude, I don't know if I can handle the 2 of them. They're so witty that I would feel like a really like a dull I mean, they're just incredibly quick, but yes, it would be fun to have them. Wow, yes. Okay, so Jimmy and Ronnie, there's gonna be a reach out thanks to Charles for you, okay? And our audience would love it, obviously. Yeah. Anyone else you can think of that you'd love to have on the show?
should I just name the whole cast of
Yeah,
the
absolutely. You got Chloe, you got I mean, you
Well,
know
Chloe was amazing in the show, and I really hope people appreciate it. I mean, I think lost in a lot of this is that there's many people in this cast that show different aspects of the
Oh, yes.
experience, and so, yeah, Chloe was great in the show. So, yeah, get Chloe on. Yeah, too many to name. If I start naming people, we're just gonna be going on.
Exactly. Uh, Charlie, I mean, I love the idea that you've got 2 names that I can call on here. Um, this has been a really incredible episode for me. I like I said, I felt like I've only scratched the surface in terms of your thought leadership and what you've shared with the world and your thinking. And I hope this is a tease for our audience to go and dive deeper into either reading the book, watching the TV show. I think even your first book, How to Live Safely in a Science Fiction Universe. I think that's really interesting. A technician that fixes time machines for people, but it's much deeper than that. And again, somebody on a quest to find their father. I think it's so fascinating. So I am picking up that book next. Okay. And so thank you for your time today. I really also appreciate you sharing the idea that, to make that decision to actually go after your passion is one where you actually have to bet on yourself. And for our listeners, it's probably one of the best bets you'll ever make because you're going to be with yourself forever and you're probably the most invested and probably have the most resources to fix it if it's not working too.
Well said, yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. Thank you, Charles. Listen to all episodes of Aconic on aconicpodcast.com. You can also catch new episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.